Chapter 10, in which all that warrior training comes in handy. Sealed in a jar with his demons. Radu grinned. Good. Let it be just him and them. His fight, his fault, and only him to pay the price. Well, he and his future wife perhaps, and wasn't she a prize? Ready? He urged the horse straight at where the century of fledglings were still cringing away from their burning compatriot. As soon as they were within throwing distance, Ecaterina flung the bottles, sharp and accurate as throwing knives. The fledglings on which they landed recoiled into their fellows. Infected by their terror, the others tried to scatter, and Radu picked up speed, galloped clockwise around the little Strigoi army, keeping them packed in tight. Ahead, a thing that had once been a blacksmith darted out of the crowd into the horse's path. The horse jerked nervously. Radu murmured to it, even as he nocked an arrow and let fly. The blacksmith was hurled backwards into the ranks, burning with a different fire, green flames curling up the fletching of the arrow from where its wooden shaft was buried in his heart. He picked off 2 more, trying to get out of the scrum ahead of him, then turned in the saddle to shoot those who were trying to escape behind his back. Between the arrow shots, Ecaterina threw more grenades of sunlight into the tight-packed knot of newly risen Strigoi until the light from them became so intense he couldn't see to aim. He let the horse drift aside then, waiting at a safe distance for the desperate and the determined to break out of what had become an enormous bonfire, ready to pick them off as they ran. "Enough! That's enough!" His mother's voice roared as loud as the bellow of a bull, all its sweetness turned into gravel. Reluctantly, he turned toward the dais, looked up to find her standing above Ecaterina's father with a sword point held to his throat. Decibel was curled up on his side, breathing in shallow, harsh punches of air, but not dead yet. "Darling, you've been very bad. You're always so ungrateful. Stop this, or he dies." It seemed perhaps the longest time of his life, drawing the bow, aiming, hesitating to lose. She was not really his mother. She had killed his real mother, taken her place, so that he would not be able to do this. He should not play into her hands, but still he hesitated to release. "Daddy!" Ecaterina shouted again. She hissed against Radu's back. "Don't you dare let her kill my father! I'll kill you! I'll kill you like you deserve! Shoot her!" And he couldn't. He failed, gave up and adjusted his aim, let fly. The arrow hit Elia in the back of her hand, piercing it, knocking the sword aside to go clattering across the planks. Elia screamed and bent over her wound. As she did so, a small and glittering thing hit her on the cheekbone. It shattered. The sun grenade did not work as quickly with one so old and powerful as it had with the fledglings. Elia clutched at her face with her hands. Face and fingers began to smoulder, the light spilling out between her fingers, eating inward and spreading like a spark on a nest of tinder. "Mother!" The urge to run to her, to comfort, was blinding. He had turned the horse toward the dais, set his heels in its ribs without thinking, when there came a blur of white smoke. Blood hit his face, the horse stumbled, tripped over its legs and fell forward, tipping him over its head. But Radu had been falling from horses since he was a child. He twisted in mid-air, hit the ground feet first in a pool of warm blood. He saw at a glance that the horse's throat had been torn out bodily, and that Constantine stood in the mess, crimson and dripping from head to toe. There was no such reluctance in him to aim and loose at his father as there had been for Elia. He felt only a creeping sense of guilt that he was allowed to do what he had always wanted to do. He got 2 shots off. One thunked into the flesh at Constantine's shoulder, one pierced his knee and made him yowl like an enormous cat. Both slowed him a little, but not enough for Radu to get out of his way when he charged forward and brought his sword down, cleaving effortlessly through the tense string and the recurved wood of Radu's bow. Radu dropped the remnants and scrambled to the back of the saddle where he had tied the sack of bottles. In the corner of his eye he could see Ecaterina. Having fallen with as little mishap as he, she had run to the dais and was now climbing up to come to her father's side, all her attention on him. Rooting for bottles, there must be some left. Radu saw her kneel by Decipal's side, saw Mahmoud stir out of his meat puppet blankness and stalk close. "Katya, behind you!" An iron grip closed on the back of his neck just as his fingers found the last bottle. It should go in the face or over the heart, but he couldn't twist in that inhuman strength to get a good aim at either. Constantine's hand tightened on Radu's nape as though it would crush his spine and rip it out. A waste of his last grenade, but he smashed it down on his father's hand. The oil felt pleasantly cool, wintry, against the hot bruise on his own fingers. But his father let go, staggered away, hissing like a dragon, while fire ate the bones beneath his skin all the way up his right arm. Radu allowed himself a moment's respite. 2 steps back while he drew his sword, a brief exploring glance about the battlefield, and up to where Ecaterina struggled in Mahmoud's grip. Radu's warning hadn't been enough, or Mahmoud had simply been too fast for it to make a difference. Mahmoud had Ecaterina by the hair, pulling her throat to him, paying no attention to her apparent flailing. Stupid creature. Radu hardly needed to see the movement of her hands to her pockets to know what would happen next. As Mahmoud's lips lowered to her skin, she slammed 1 bottle into his mouth and a second into his belly. He could hear her cry out as the glass shattered in her hand, cutting her. But Mahmoud the warrior, Caliph of the face of the earth, burnt like an oil-soaked reed and crumbled into the dust. A shout of horror went up, like the boom of a distant cannon, from the watching Turkish army. Radu's own countrymen, freed of the Strigoi control, had stopped trying to get inside the dome of Frank's protection. They no longer wanted to tear Radu and Ecaterina to shreds. But now it seemed the Turkish army had inherited the desire. "You've no friends out there!" Constantine had strapped the remains of his arm to his body with his belt. The blood in which he was covered had begun to congeal and stink. Radu thought back and could remember nothing. No tenderness, guidance, honesty or love that he owed this creature that outweighed a lifetime of slavery and fear. Constantine gave a grin that might have been intended to be winsome, but for the chunks of tendon between his teeth. "Spare me, and I'll hold them back. I'll let you and your chosen ones live." Having witnessed Ecaterina murder their sultan through some form of witchcraft, the Turks were incensed. All Radu could see was their army throwing itself repeatedly against some invisible barrier. But now that he had seen the reflections of Frank's magic, he could imagine it as a dome of palest gold, quivering like a struck cymbal beneath the fury of the Turkish forces. To the north, where the largest street held the greatest concentration of troops, there came a rumble and shout. An artillery company ran up their cannon and hurled it like a battering ram against the impermeable barrier. Even from here, Radu could see the strain on Frank's face. He looked tense as the wire of a pendulum, and the long hands that seemed to hold up the sky trembled. But his lips moved, and his face was lit from within by a stern, transcendent glow. For all that he was dressed like a modern young gentleman in a snuff-coloured suit and riding boots, he looked very much like a wizard from a storyteller's word hoard. Mirella, running back from some errand of her own with a red-bearded man by her side, stopped and stared at him, open-mouthed. Frank was even, Radu saw with some disbelief, now hovering several feet above the ground as if standing on a pillar of light. Radu could have shouted for joy to see the insecure little scholar look something like a god, indifferent to the laws that bound other men. But the impressive display was equally obvious to everyone in the Turkish army. None of them could fail to see that it was Frank who was holding them back. Constantine's sword glinted in the light of sorcery as he drove it toward Radu's ribs. The glint saved Radu's life. He twisted aside so the blade glanced off the metal plaques of his belt. "I can feel your reluctance," Constantine grinned. "You couldn't kill your own father, child. Just think what that would make you." Radu had been thinking of that all his life. Parricide would make him a murderer, yes. Perhaps it took one monster to destroy another. Constantine laughed and, tilting back his head, shouted in Turkish, "Stone the infidel!" This made no sense at first. Radu ignored it, circling his father, trying to come to a position from which he could take a clean swing at the neck. But then Frank cried out, and the reflection of his magic wavered along the blade of the sword, shades of indigo and viridian flashing through the light. Radu looked, he couldn't help it, transfixed at the sight of the Janissaries, hurling whatever they could find, boots and knives and boulders, up at Frank, breaking his concentration, smacking into his upturned hands. A cobblestone hit Frank in the temple. He came out of his trance just long enough to lock gazes with Radu, still that strange helpless innocence in him which had prompted Radu to save him, to start all of this. Then his eyes rolled up into white glistening slits. Blood trickled from his nose. He fell back, limp and defenceless, into the angry crowd. Constantine surged in while Radu was distracted, grabbed his sword arm above the wrist and pressed. The Strigoy's strength was gargantuan. Radu felt his bones bend. He buckled, trying not to scream, and groped behind himself on the corpse of his horse where he had left his broken bow, his quiver. There! His arm snapped, both bones, one after another, shearing into sharp points. The pressure of Constantine's hand grew, grinding the bones together, slicing the knife-like tips of them through the muscle and skin from beneath. With Frank's barrier down, Radu could hear the running feet, the jangle of sword belts and armour that was the sound of his enemies getting closer. "They're coming for you," Constantine leaned in to whisper it, fetid breath cold. "They will ram that stake through you from the arse to the mouth, but not fast. With luck you'll be screaming for days. Or," he shook Radu by the broken arm, surprising a whimper out of him, "there is still time for you to accept eternity at my side. I am the only one who can save you now." Bone soared through Radu's skin in a burst of blood, drawing Constantine's eyes. He lowered his head to sniff, and Radu, so mad with pain he had scarcely had space to be angry, brought up his other arm with all his strength and punched a wooden arrow into his father's heart. "I will take impalement over you." Constantine clutched at his chest, astonished. He tried to yank the arrow out, but it was in all the way to the fletching, and even that now was burning with a blue-hot flame. He choked, and fire belched from his mouth even as the skin began to peel back from his eyelids. Radu looked away, to the soot-scorched dais, where 2 Seljuk archers had knocked Ecaterina's feet out from beneath her, were holding her down on her knees. Death, he thought, as a dozen hands seized him and threw him down, pushed his face into the cobbles. Well, he hadn't really believed it would end any other way. They pulled his broken arm behind him to manacle it, and the fire arrow of pain ignited the little pocket of madness he kept in him for reserve. Death, then. But death while fighting, death clean and sudden at the end of a blade. He would force them to kill him now, not take him for torture at their leisure. He kicked out blindly, felt someone grunt and reel back. The grip on his arms slackened enough that he could hurl himself forward and drive his still lowered head into an unprotected stomach. That gave him space enough to lurch to his feet and, reeling, weaponless, punch the closest warrior in the face, all but pushing himself onto the sharp edge of the man's sword. Thanks for listening. That was Sons of Devils, read by Galadeer. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers.